That's good. I don't know why I did that. What was I going to do?
I don't hear you now.
I'm talking to myself. If anyone wants to chat, has questions for the instructor or anything like that, feel free to. Okay. Feel free to join in the chat, the class chat channel. Wally, I hear that you're having a hard time joining. The recording will be posted on our YouTube page. So that's probably why some people were dropping in and out.
Having a hard time joining?
Yeah, they were saying that it would kick them out or drop them out.
I think a lot of times with Discord, using the desktop app too can help. If you're using like the browser, sometimes I've had issues with the browser instead of just going straight to the app.
Yeah, I got you. I always use the app. Mm-hmm. Okay, I guess we'll go ahead and get started.
Right.
Again, thank you, Bo. Is it Bo or Bo?
Yeah, it's Bo.
Bo. Thank you for joining us here at DC 813. We're glad to have you.
Glad to be here.
I'm going to let you get started here in a minute. What was I going to say? Screw it. Thank you so much for having us, and I'll let you take it away from here. If anyone has any questions, feel free to type questions in the chat channel for the class. It's the class chat channel, and we will try to get those to Bo so you can answer.
Yeah, and I can keep an eye on it too as we go. It's usually good way to kind of go about it. So yeah, definitely interact, please, if you guys have any questions. All right, so today I'm going to be talking about getting started in Pentesting the Cloud, Azure. I am pretty excited about this particular talk because I wrote the training course for basically breaching. It's called Breaching the Cloud, and it's for attacking multiple different types of cloud services. So it's really focused about like AWS, Azure, and GCP. And what I wanted to do is this series of getting started in Pentesting the Cloud for each specific one of them, and basically just giving like an hour-long presentation talking about some of the key things that I think, like if you're just getting started in attacking cloud services, here's some of the things to keep in mind as you go about it. And each one of them have unique, interesting, I guess, ways to go about attacking them. So that's the gist of kind of why I put this talk together. It's really meant to be kind of a primer for Azure pen testing, and hopefully it will help make you aware of some of the common terms associated with Azure and Azure assessments, as well as the potential attack surface. All right. So about me, I actually live in Lakeland, so I'm not too far away from you guys. You guys are over in Tampa. I am a pen tester and red teamer at Black Hills InfoSec. Like I said, I wrote a course called Breaching the Cloud. That is a 4-day course that if you like what you see today, you might like the course. I know Grace took it, so I hope he liked it. I got a few certs, spoken quite a bit, and written about a bunch of open source tools. And a few of those I'm going to share today in this talk because they directly apply to attacking Azure services. I also produced some synthwave metal music for a band called No Bandwidth. All right, so roadmap for today. First off, we're going to look at identifying attack surface. And the attack surface, when it comes to Azure, can actually get confusing if you don't know what to look for. And also, if you aren't clear on objectives of the engagement. So first thing we're going to do is talk about what you should be looking at in order to have a very thorough viewpoint of the attack surface. Secondly, we're going to be looking at performing Recon and particularly doing external attacks against Azure environments. Then after that, we're going to talk about authentication because authenticating to the various cloud services, specifically Azure and Microsoft 365, there's actually a number of different ways you can do it. And there's a number of different configuration issues that arise depending on how organizations have deployed their authentication mechanisms. Then we're going to talk about post-compromise. So after you get credentials, after you have compromised a host in an Azure service or an Azure resource, we're going to talk about what you can do from that point on and potentially get access to. And again, like this is an hour-long talk, so we can't go too in depth. But I'm going to give you some high-level stuff to get started. And then after we talk about post-compromise, we'll talk about the Azure subscription hierarchy, because that comes into play quite heavily when we start looking at privilege escalation, what we have permissions to do, and so on and so forth. Then we're going to talk about a few resource-specific issues. So things like, open Azure Storage Blobs or virtual machines that have specific issues. We're going to talk about some very specific things at a very high-level view to kind of show you, here's some key things to kind of keep an eye out for as you go about attacking Azure environments. And finally, I'm going to talk about leveraging different scanning tools and how you can use those scanning tools to help drive your assessments, to help automate your assessments, and help ultimately attack networks faster. All right, so why Azure? All right, so today, the whole focus of this talk is on Azure. And the main reason is because it's extremely popular for productivity and computing resources. So we have, at Black Hills, we do a lot of different assessments. We do red team assessments, web apps, pivots, soon compromise, internals, externals, all like the gamut of things, right? And in a lot of those different types of assessments, Azure tends to at least come up some. And we're seeing a lot of different hybrid environments that are making this kind of pivot from using just on-prem resources to being hybrid and now using a lot of cloud resources. And the thing with Azure is that a lot of companies are tying Active Directory to it because it's so easy just to spin up Microsoft 365, and then now you have all your email, you have SharePoint, all this stuff in the cloud. And especially right now, with everyone working from home for the pandemic, you've got all these organizations that are just pushing everything to the cloud. And the key thing here is that a lot of the time, those hybrid environments have that direct Active Directory or that Active Directory connection. So you have credentials that are being utilized both in the cloud and on-prem. And we'll discuss why that's important throughout today. Then the other key thing about Azure is that a lot of the endpoints are publicly accessible, right? So a lot of the different APIs that we're going to talk about hitting are publicly accessible APIs, the login portals, that kind of stuff. And then, one of the big things that I try to talk about in terms of post-compromise is a lot of times now, we don't necessarily have to get internal access to find sensitive data. A lot of times that sensitive data is sitting on SharePoint or is sitting in some sort of cloud service, OneDrive. And in a lot of the engagements that we're doing now, it comes down to us compromising an account and then using that account to simply log into Microsoft 365 and find sensitive data in SharePoint. And then the last thing I want to mention here is that all of the pen testing techniques that I'm going to talk about today that are related to Azure are going to apply to multiple different types of engagements. Like I mentioned, at Black Hills, we do red teams, externals, soon compromise, that kind of stuff. And today we're going to talk about the angle of which you're attacking the Azure environment, whether it be from like a red team perspective where you're completely external and you're trying to get in, or you're actually dealing with like more of an assumed compromise scenario. And then, web apps, there's tons of companies that are using web apps in Azure. So a lot of different techniques will apply to these different types of engagements. All right, so we're going to talk about identifying attack surface. And one thing I want to mention real quick is that this talk, we have an hour here scheduled. We'll see exactly where that ends up being because I haven't given this talk yet, and I did pull a lot of content from my class, and so we'll kind of see. Hopefully, I nailed it in terms of timing, but just want to give you that heads up. All right, so for identifying attack surface. When it comes to figuring out what you're going to attack with Azure, you have to consider a few different things. And a lot of this is going to stem from your just discussions with the customer during the rules of engagement call. So before we start any testing with any customer, we generally have a rules of engagement call where we talk to them and say, hey, what is your goal for this assessment? And depending on if that's a red team, we might just be attacking completely externally. But in a lot of times when we're doing actual Azure cloud assessments, we're doing more of an API approach where we're actually authenticated to the Azure API. So I wanted to talk about some of these different ways to look at the Azure attack surface. So first off, the external attack surface, right? This is exactly what it sounds like. An unauthenticated approach to attacking different Azure resources. And this is purely attacking, public resources from the internet. So that's one thing you have to consider. What can attackers get to externally? Second thing is internal access to Azure from a resource level. And what I mean by that is testing an actual internal cloud network, so virtual network within a cloud service from another resource such as a virtual machine. And the reason we would want to do something like that is a lot of times the internal networks that get deployed within Azure's cloud don't end up getting the same patch cycles. A lot of times they get forgotten. And we end up finding different software level vulnerabilities that you can't actually detect from an API level. So that's why this internal approach can be necessary at times. The third thing that we're going to talk about is API access internal assessment. What this is, or what this looks like, is literally authenticating to Azure API, so whether it be the Microsoft Graph API or the Service Management API, and trying to identify vulnerabilities via API calls. And a lot of times this could either be viewed as kind of an almost like a configuration audit of sorts, because generally what we ask for in these scenarios, if we're doing an Azure assessment, is just reader level access to the subscription. That way we can read all of the different items, the different resources, and we'll use that access to attempt to identify any other vulnerabilities purely from API call level. So so in terms of kind of getting a thorough coverage there, depending on the assessment and depending on your conversations with the customer, it might end up being just purely external. They might want you to just do black box stuff, or they might want to say, hey, we want to know everything you can tell us about our Azure configuration. And in those cases, API level access combined with internal testing, combined with external attacking, can give a really good overall view. All right, so another thing that I want to kind of clear up right up front is something that I see a lot of confusion on when it comes to testing, quote unquote, Azure. So there's Azure Resource Manager, and there's also this thing called Microsoft 365. A lot of people know Microsoft 365 from the Outlook, email level, SharePoint, that kind of thing, Teams. Microsoft 365 is all about the productivity side of the house. So, a lot of people confuse having an account that can authenticate to Microsoft 365 or having something that can, look at different Azure services. And the reason that I want to clear this up is because, I've been on multiple engagements where we get access to a user's credential, but they're just an Azure Active Directory user that has access to Microsoft 365 services alone. And unless that user is actually a member of a subscription or has a role in some subscription, they're not going to have access to any of the other interesting stuff on the Azure Resource Manager side. So Azure Resource Manager is where whenever a user at a tenant deploys a resource such as a virtual machine, a database, storage containers, any sort of serverless architecture, that kind of stuff requires subscription access, which all of your general Azure AD users are not going to have that. They're in most cases just going to have that Microsoft 365 productivity side of the house, which in some cases, that might be all you want, because like I mentioned, things like SharePoint can tend to have plenty of good stuff to look at. All right, so we're going to talk about Recon and performing external attacks first up here. All right, so one of the first things that I like to do and it really doesn't matter which type of engagement it is. One of the first things I like to do on most engagements is try to determine Microsoft 365 usage. And there's a couple ways you can do this fairly easily. One of the most easiest ways to do this is just go to the Outlook portal, which is outlook.office365.com, and then attempt to authenticate or submit a username that includes the domain name of the company you're testing. And if that actually redirects, you might discover that they are in fact using Microsoft 365. There's a couple other links I want to show you though that can give you a little bit more detail about the Microsoft 365 configurations. So first up, we've got this first link here, which has the get user realm.srf on the end here. If you supply a login parameter with the domain of the company you're testing, you'll get back a page that looks like this screenshot here, if they are in fact using Microsoft 365. So in the screenshot here, you will actually be able to determine, are they federated? So we'll talk about what federation is in ADFS in a moment, but that can be a key thing because that can determine where you attempt to authenticate. The second link there, if you supply the target domain to the OpenID configuration URL, you can actually get the tenant ID back for a tenant or for a customer who has a tenant or is a tenant of Microsoft 365. And that can be useful because if you are ever trying to authenticate as a service principal, you will most oftentimes need the tenant ID as well. All right, so the next thing that we like to do is figure out valid users. And throughout the years, there's been a few different interesting username enumeration techniques. Some of the more interesting ones don't actually involve submitting an authentication request, such as the one that I have here at the very bottom URL, this OneDrive username. So this is one that I've had spotty success with. And this one in particular, it basically just enumerates usernames based off of OneDrive URLs. The other way that I want to talk about is utilizing one of the tools that I wrote called MSOL Spray, where this endpoint that I'm hitting with MSOL Spray is actually very verbose, and any of the authentication attempts that we perform with MSOL Spray will actually tell us a lot of information, which we'll talk more about MSOL Spray in a little bit. And we talk about password spraying. But why do we want to perform user enumeration? And in general, it's because we've done Recon, we've found users or employees of the company. We want to know what are the valid emails so that we can have a more efficient approach to doing password attacks. One of the key things that I look for externally from an unauthenticated context is data in public Azure blobs. So, if you've ever seen a breach article about something stored in an S3 bucket, right? Like you see this all the time where companies are using these public storage buckets to post data for whatever application they have. And a lot of times, if those get discovered, it becomes big news because it can tend to contain sensitive data. The thing here is Azure has a similar storage facility called Azure Storage, and it basically uses these blobs to store unstructured data. And the way that the format of the Azure Storage looks is you have containers and blobs, and we'll talk about the different policies in which those can be made publicly accessible. But the thing about Azure S3 and the thing about Azure Storage and S3 separately, and then a lot of the other Azure resources, they tend to actually create these predictable URLs at certain addresses. So this allows us to perform DNS lookups to determine if a company is utilizing certain resources. So, for example, if we're able to determine that a company is using their own company name as the name of a storage account, we can start brute forcing that. And if you brute force, storage account name .blob.core.windows.net, you can discover if the entry is valid, if the entry is there, whether or not a company is actually using that service or not. And then from there, by performing other brute forcing against the potential containers in those blobs, we can determine if they're open or not and determine if they're publicly accessible. So how does one make a publicly accessible Azure blob? Well, it's very easy. So whenever you deploy a new container, you actually create this policy based off of these three different levels here, where you can have private, which means no anonymous access is granted, meaning it won't be public at all. You can have blob access, where you have anonymous access just to the blob. So this is very similar to if you had a direct URL from like G Drive, right? Like let's say you had like a G Drive file and you wanted to share it with somebody, and it gives you that direct URL. So you'd have to have that direct URL to the file to actually do it. Container level access, though, if container anonymous access is enabled, then that entire container is publicly accessible, and you can actually enumerate any of the files within it. So there's a tool to help us do this, and that's Cloudinum from Chris Moberly. There's a couple other ones too, but I like this one a lot because this one actually will scan Azure, AWS, GCP for a few different things. So it scans for first off, these open buckets, but on like Azure, it'll look for databases, virtual machines, web apps, and a lot more. So if you're looking for open buckets, that's the tool to go for. All right. The other thing that we like to do externally is password attacks, right? Password spraying is one of the most common ways we get in. And, I've been on multiple engagements where we just spray the season a year and get multiple hits. And so what password spraying is essentially, taking the entire user list from a company, whether that be just a user list we generated in Recon, or if we got it from the global address list or whatever. And then basically, instead of trying multiple password attempts against each one of those accounts, we're going to take one password and try it against all of the accounts. So literally there's one, failed login for each account. It won't lock anybody out. And we might get lucky with, season year or whatever you choose to spray with. So for password spraying Azure and Microsoft 365 accounts, I wrote a script called MSOL spray. And this is the one I mentioned previously where you can enumerate users as well because of how verbose the endpoint is that we're hitting with the script. So first off, the most important thing is the user credential valid. That'll tell you that, which is important, right? Like if you're going to do password spraying, you want to know if the credential is valid. Second thing is MFA enabled on the account? So you can actually just determine based off of a successful authentication if there's also MFA enabled as well, and it won't trigger like the automatic push notification of the user. It will tell you if a tenant doesn't exist, if the user doesn't exist, if the account is locked. There's like 200 other error codes, so you can get a lot of other information back from that employee. One of the protections that Azure has is something called Smart Lockout, and there's another one that's actually literally called Password Protection. So Azure Password Protection is something that prevents users from picking certain passwords. This is something they would have to enable, but it's effectively a password filter of sorts where they say, I'm not going to allow any of my employees to pick a password of anything that contains a company name or any season, that kind of stuff. That way they can eliminate a lot of these common sprayable terms. Azure Smart Lockout, on the other hand, is very similar to the way fail demand works, where it essentially locks out an IP address after submitting multiple attempts. So when you do password spraying, if you're password spraying from the same IP address, by default, Azure Smart Lockout will lock you out after it's like 10 attempts, I think, in a minute or so. So the way you get around that is just rotate your IPs. And one of the ways you can do that is with a tool called Fireprox. So we got the link there for Fireprox. But basically, you would use Fireprox to spin up it utilizes API gateway. And it creates effectively an endpoint on API gateway that you would then point MSOL spray at. And MSOL spray would then be rotated through API gateway IPs. All right, authentication. So, there's more ways to authenticate to cloud providers than just usernames and passwords. We just talked about password spraying, but a lot of the APIs will accept things like certificates, We have to consider multi-factor as well, right? And a lot of times we'll find things like service accounts that don't actually utilize those certs. Sometimes, externally, we might find keys that just get posted publicly to code that are in repositories, right? So what do we do if we, find service principal credentials posted on the internet somewhere? A lot of times it just looks like a client ID and secret. So we can just take the client ID and secret and potentially use APIs to authenticate. But in those cases, you might need a tenant ID, like I mentioned earlier. But finding authentication points and finding and understanding how they have configured authentication is really key. So this next section is really all about that. All right, so some forms of authentication to consider. First off, this slide is not meant to be like 100% related, but it's things that are just to keep in the back of your mind as we go through the next few slides. These are all different things that I think of when I first start looking at an organization that uses Azure. So I want to know, first off, are they using ADFS, or are they using password sync or password authentication? Because that will define how I perform my password attacks. Is there any way to authenticate via certs? Do they have conditional access policies? Which I have a section up in a few slides about conditional access policies to kind of go over some of the more interesting things to look for there. Or can I find long-term access tokens? Are there any legacy authentication portals that we can still hit? All right, so password hash synchronization. So the next 3 slides, we're going to be talking about 3 different ways to configure the ways in which users can authenticate to Azure for an organization. And these are all preference to the organization that set this up, right? To the customer of Azure. And a lot of times it just comes down to where they want their data kept, or where they want their credentials stored. So first up here, with password hash sync is a full clone of credentials into Azure. So all of your Active Directory credentials just get straight up cloned into Azure. And then anytime somebody goes to authenticate to Microsoft 365 or Azure, they're literally logging in directly to Azure and it's being validated within Azure itself. The second way to configure things is what's called pass-through authentication. The main difference here between this and the last one is that instead of credentials being stored in Azure, they're being stored on-prem on an AD Connect server. And there's actually a service that runs on that AD Connect server that says, hey, somebody's trying to authenticate to Azure, let's validate it locally. And if it validates locally, then the user gets authenticated. But the user is still authenticating directly to Microsoft. The only difference there is Microsoft is saying, hey, on-prem service, is this credential valid? Another really common setup that we see a lot is ADFS, so Active Directory Federation Services. The thing with Active Directory Federation Services is similar to the last one. Your credentials are stored only on-prem. However, the means in which users authenticate is directed towards your own on-prem environment. So if I go to log in as a user to Azure, or I go to log into Outlook on Microsoft 365, what's going to happen is once I go to authenticate, Microsoft is going to redirect me to your on-prem server, and I'm going to then attempt to authenticate there. And then if that's successful, your on-prem ADFS server will give me a token that I can use to now access Microsoft 365. And the main thing that I want to kind of point out here is this visibly looks different than the last two. So in the last 2 examples, if you're trying to authenticate, you're going to be authenticating to a MicrosoftOnline.com web portal. In this case, ADFS, you're going to be redirected to some other ADFS portal, usually on-prem. So with authentication comes the topic of conditional access policies in MFA. This is something that I see inconsistencies come about pretty often. So this is something that I want to talk about too, as a kind of, hey, if you're gonna attack Azure environments, think about conditional access policies. All right, so Microsoft 365 and Azure have these built-in MFA options. And so anytime you sign up for a Microsoft account, you get these default options that you can use the Authenticator app or OAuth hardware tokens, SMS, voice call, and it's pretty good because once you authenticate or once you set up an account, you get these things called, or you get this policy called security defaults. It's an Azure Active Directory setting that's going to help protect your account by a lot of really good things. So things like it requires all the users to register for MFA, right? That's great, right? Blocks legacy authentication protocols, which we'll talk more about those in a little bit. But legacy authentication portals tend to be the bane of all the security teams in the world because these legacy auth portals are the ones we go after as attackers because they generally get less protection. Security defaults requires MFA during authentication when necessary. So anytime there's like a new place they're logging in from, or new IP address, new device, that kind of stuff, it'll trigger MFA as opposed to just letting them go in single factor. It protects privileged activities like going to the Azure Portal, which I'll talk about that in a minute. That's generally one of my first things that I like to do as an attacker after getting credentials, just go straight to the Azure Portal and then start clicking around. So these are great settings to have, but sometimes more granular options are necessary. So whether a company wants a user to be able to authenticate from a certain device with single factor, or you might have executives that they don't like MFA, so they force you to disable it for their IP address or for their device, that kind of thing. So these conditional access policies are a lot more advanced. However, security defaults has to be disabled to even use them. So in order to take that leap into using conditional access policies, you have to disable all these other really awesome things that were set up for you, like blocking legacy authentication protocols. So conditional access policies, they're these fine-grained controls where you have the ability to say, I want this user on this device from this specific application to authenticate with MFA. You can say you can make all these different rules. Like I've tested companies that they utilize conditional access policies to do things like allow single factor access to Microsoft 365 from their own IP space, but they required MFA everywhere else. So like places in the world. Not a great policy. However, it is something that people do because it's one of those ease of use kind of things, right? So with conditional access policies, you have the ability to disable legacy authentication, things like SMTP, Exchange ActiveSync, Exchange Web Services, POP3, IMAP, that kind of stuff. But the problem here is that sometimes employees, they need access to these legacy portals. Historically, different clients, such as Outlook for Mac, would only support things like Exchange Web Services. And the bad thing about Exchange Web Services is you can't enable things like MFA on Exchange Web Services specifically. So in those cases, either they apply a conditional access policy that says only this user from this application can authenticate single factor to this legacy portal, or more oftentimes than not, they just make a rule that says, we're going to let everyone authenticate single factor. And so, one of the other things I want to note here is that Exchange ActiveSync has its own checkbox for some reason. So if you look on the right here, you've got legacy authentication clients, and the other clients list here is effectively all of the other legacy authentication portals. But for some reason, they said, you know what, ActiveSync needs its own. So, I found a lot of environments that it's like I test Exchange Web Services, I test SMTP, all of these are like blocked, but then for some reason they didn't check the checkbox for ActiveSync, and so I'm able to auth single factor ActiveSync. And the other thing is, like, legacy auth was supposed to be end of life back in it was like October of 2020. But it's been, because of COVID, it got pushed back to the second half of this year. Which, we'll see. We'll see how they actually end up doing disabling that. Another key thing to think about with conditional access policies are device platforms. So device platforms are basically the useration that the user's coming from when they authenticate. So if you read like the actual statement here, Azure AD identifies the platform that's being used by the user using information provided by the device, such as user agent strings. So when they create a conditional access policy that says Android devices they can auth single factor. All that is a user agent string. So if you just change your user agent string to that, you would get a single factor. And the way that looks is like this. So if you authenticate, or if there's a conditional access policy set up to allow authentication with mobile user agents single factor, you might be able to just literally change your user agent and have something that looks kind of like these two pictures here. Where on the left side, we're authenticating with just the standard, web browser, right? Using a desktop user agent. And then on the right, all I did was change the user agent to Android user agent, and now we're in single factor. So that is something I have seen on engagements. So to kind of help you guys quickly assess what portals are single factor, I wrote another tool called MFASweep. And the whole point of this tool is I got a credential. I know there's multi-factor on, let's say, the web portal. But I want to know, is there single factor anywhere else? And I tried to kind of collect what I think are the majority of the different endpoints you would want to try to authenticate to. So what it does is it says, hey, Microsoft Graph API, are you single factor? Hey, Azure Service Management API, can I authenticate to you single factor? Goes through this list of a few different things. Exchange Web Services is probably the big one here that we see more oftentimes than not being single factor. A lot of companies we test end up having their web portals covered fine, like the actual Microsoft 365 web portal. But those legacy auth portals get you. If you don't cover those, we'll find them, and then you can auth to things like Exchange Web Services, ActiveSync, and it also will check ADFS as well. So to run it, it's a PowerShell script, so you would create a PowerShell window, import the script, and then keep in mind that it's literally just taking the credentials you give it and authenticating to these different portals. So it creates, at least 6 different authentication attempts. So if you put the wrong password, you might end up locking out an account there. So just be careful. It can also check ADFS, like I said. So it will attempt to hit that URL that I posted earlier in the Recon section to determine if they have ADFS. If it does, it will try to authenticate there and determine if it can do it single factor as well. All right, post compromise. And, this is kind of just a brain dump of sorts of here's a bunch of things that I think about. These are like the things that are on my mind when attacking an Azure environment, whether it be an Azure assessment specifically or even just a red team, So looking at post-compromise, just keep in mind, this is not like everything. I literally have a 4-day class for this. But this is something that should help you kind of get going on the post-compromise side. All right, so post-compromise recon. After we get access, who do we have access as? Are we able to go to the Azure Service Management portal or Azure Resource Manager and start looking at subscriptions? Which we'll talk about the hierarchy with subscriptions in a minute. Is MFA enabled? We addressed that with conditional access policies a minute ago. But what can we access? Because this really is the most important thing, right? Can we get to things like web applications? Can we get to storage? Who are the admins? How are we going to attempt to escalate to admin? And are there any protections that are in place? You can actually see via the APIs licenses for things like advanced threat protection and Defender. So one of the first things I like to do after getting a credential is just go straight to the Azure portal itself. So if you go to portal.azure.com, even if so the cool thing about Microsoft services is it utilizes the same session right across the different services. So if let's say that you phished somebody and you phish to the Outlook portal, right? You're looking at their email. But all you'd have to do is use that same session in the same browser and just go to portal.azure.com and you're looking at the Azure portal as long as they haven't disabled that access. So this is one of the first things I like to do, and the reason is because any Azure Active Directory user, which that entails any of the Microsoft 365 users, have the ability to go to the Azure portal and click users and then see the full Azure AD user list. And why would we want to do that? Well, if we do that, then we can actually go back to our password spraying now with a full user list, right? And similarly, we can get the same list from the global address list in O365, right? But what we're doing here is basically just getting all of the employee names so that we can go and attack those from a password level as well and get more access, right? If the portal's locked down, we can still likely use PowerShell commands, because unless they've gone through and ran this command below, where they actually set the MS Online settings to prevent user access from reading via command line, which I have not seen that in the wild yet, then you can likely authenticate via command line and then start enumerating the different services from there. So how do you start using command line access? Well, there's a few different tools out there to help with this. So there's PowerShell modules. We have the AZ PowerShell module, which is basically the module that we're going to utilize for assessing subscription level resources. So the AZ PowerShell module really is focused on us enumerating things like virtual machines, any sort of storage, anything that's on the subscription side, right? Those resources. There's the Azure AD and MS Online modules as well. So these modules are focused on the Azure Active Directory side of the house. And we can use those to enumerate users, groups, that kind of stuff. Then we have a tool called the Azure Cross-Platform CLI tools, which is it's a very popular tool as well because it is, it's cross-platform. It's on Linux and Windows, and that's the AV CLI. And I put together a list of a lot of the commands that I would go through, upon getting access in these Cloud Pentest cheat sheets that are in my repo on the slide here. All right, so in terms of Azure subscription hierarchy, so organizations can have multiple subscriptions. So if I go to create a new account on Microsoft 365 or Azure, there's a couple things that I need to consider when it comes to subscriptions. First off, Microsoft 365 doesn't actually require what's called a subscription. Okay, so if you are a tenant, or if you create a tenant within Microsoft's Azure architecture, and you buy Microsoft 365 licenses, what happens is each one of those accounts that you want to generate for Microsoft 365 usage gets an Azure Active Directory user, but they don't necessarily have what's called a subscription attached to them. So subscriptions are really highly focused ways to spin up new resources, but Azure Active Directory users don't necessarily have access to those subscriptions. They have to be explicitly granted access to those subscriptions. So when you look at a tenant is like the highest level entity within an organization that's on Microsoft. And under it, you have these different subscriptions that you can create. So a lot of times what companies end up doing is they create subscriptions for different billing purposes. So they might say, I want to know how much my dev environment is costing us versus how much our production environment is costing us. And they literally just segment it out via that mechanism. And then the thing here is that each one of the subscriptions has different permissions on their own as well. So having access to one subscription doesn't necessarily mean you have access to other subscriptions. So keep that in mind when you're testing too, is like, if you find you got access to an account and they've got a subscription, that's not necessarily the only subscription within that tenant. Unless you have, compromised an administrative level account, you likely won't be able to see all of these subscriptions. You would have to have policies applied for you to view each one of those different subscriptions. So under the subscriptions, where you start to see the different resources get spun up. So you've got resource groups, which are effectively just folders of sorts. that allow us to kind of consolidate our different resources. Things like web applications and SQL servers. Maybe we put those in the same resource group, right? So that we know that like those, that web app has some sort of connection with this server here, right? This SQL server. This database is connected. So from a resource group level, it'd be easy for me to just kind of identify that those are, they have some sort of connectivity there. But the resources that we're talking about here, there's a ton of different types of resources in Azure. Some of the more popular ones are things like virtual machines, databases, functions, so serverless architecture, storage, that kind of stuff. Some of the built-in Azure roles. So for each subscription, for each resource within each subscription, you can apply different roles. And the key thing here is that it's all hierarchical, meaning that whatever you apply at the subscription level will get inherited down underneath. So if I say that this user is a contributor over the subscription, that now means that that user is also a contributor over everything else in the subscription. But alternatively, you can apply them at resource level as well. So you can say, hey, this user is a contributor over just this virtual machine in the environment. But these are some of the more common ones. There's actually a lot more different built-in Azure roles, and customers can create custom roles as well. So these built-in ones, owner is exactly what it sounds. It's full access, right? Like that's your administrative access to whatever subscription or whatever resource you've been applied owner to. Contributor gives you all the same stuff as owner, except it also gives you the ability to change permissions. Reader level can only read, attributes. So these are some of the more common ones. All right, so now we kind of have a brain dump of the subscription model. Let's talk about some specific resource issues that, honestly, I just want to highlight some of these things so that you're aware of them. Again, keep in mind, these are high level, right? So I'm not going to dive into each one of these too deep, but it's stuff to just keep in mind. Like if you're new to Pentesting Azure, some of the stuff you might have never heard of before. And I think that it's very valuable just to be aware of this stuff, so that you kind of at least have in the back of your mind, oh, hey, yeah, these are some things that I should be checking. All right, so first up, serverless environment variables. Now, serverless architecture, right? If you've ever looked at Lambda functions, or if you've ever heard of Azure functions, effectively what they are these pieces of code that get triggered by something, right? So a very common way to do this is to set up some sort of web application that triggers a function, a serverless function, to run this piece of code so that you don't actually have to have this server always running. Anytime that trigger happens, it just runs a piece of code and then it's done. So one of the things that we see pretty often are secrets that get stored in the code for the functions themselves. And a lot of times it's because those pieces of software, whatever the function is, needs to authenticate to something. And that could be via environment variables, it could be the source code itself, and a lot of times all you need is reader level access to these functions to view the content of them. So, like I said, this is something that I see pretty often on a lot of these cloud contests, where only having reader level access to a subscription might entail you actually having privilege escalation potential based off of clear text secrets that have been stored in the actual functions themselves. And, alternatively, they should be calling them from a key vault. Another thing that I want to highlight is this thing called the instance metadata service. So the instance metadata service is actually really interesting. So a lot of people don't realize that anytime you spin up a virtual machine, whether it be on Azure or AWS or DigitalOcean or GCP, any of the services, they all have these things called a metadata service. And what it's for is to help the VM itself orient itself within the cloud environment. And the crazy thing about this is it literally spins up a web server on your virtual machine. And it's located at this non-routable IP address. So it's at 169.254 or 169.254. And so that's something that shouldn't ever be reachable from anything except the local host itself. So the server should be the only thing that should ever be able to hit that. And so with that comes, kind of a sense of security, right? Like, okay, well, if somebody compromises my host, then, it should be game over anyway. However, a lot of people don't realize that this is a thing and don't protect against it. And one of the more common things we see are, vulnerabilities in web applications that allow you to actually send requests to that metadata service. So very common one would be something like a server-side request forgery vulnerability, where you're able to cause the web application to send a request to that local instance metadata service and retrieve a set of credentials. Because that's one of the things that the metadata service does is on the AWS side, it has the ability. You have the ability to apply IAM roles to EC2 instances, and then have the ability for that instance to request those temporary credentials from that instance metadata service. Same thing with Azure. You have these things called managed identities on Azure, where you can provide temporary access tokens simply by calling that instance metadata service. So on the Azure side, if you have an Azure VM, this is the URL at the bottom here that you would want to hit in order to check to see if there's a managed identity applied to it. Another thing, and again, remember, like, this is just a bunch of random specific issues that I want to kind of throw in here just to make you aware of. If you get access to a Microsoft 365 user account, so not necessarily somebody that has a subscription, but somebody that is a member of Azure AD, whether you password sprayed it or phished it, you can generally request the full user list from Azure Active Directory via command line. So you could use the MS Online module to do that. And one of the things that I've had good success with on engagements is where some help desk person has added a user's password to an attribute in their Active Directory description. So what you would do is basically just go pull all the attributes from the domain and then look through each of those attributes for things like passwords. And this is effectively a one-liner to help you do that. So you would run this, and what would happen is it would just go grab all the Azure AD users and then go through them for passwords. I know it's kind of a weird thing, but people do it. I've seen it a few times. One interesting thing to be aware of here is how, like, the second you spin up a Microsoft 365 account, it generates over 200 service principals by default in your tenants. And each of these service principals have different permissions through Microsoft Graph. So if you're able to compromise one of these accounts, you might be able to perform actions under that account. So from a privilege escalation perspective, one of the things you can do is, or one of the things that's kind of interesting is an application administrator. So there's a role in Azure called the application administrator. The application administrator has the ability to change passwords or certificates for service principals, but it doesn't have the ability to create new users. So one of the things you could do is start enumerating these service principals and look for permissions of the service principals that have the ability to create users. And then you could effectively change the password or set a new certificate or set a new password or secondary password. I think you can even set a secondary one. Yeah. For for that service principal. That way you're not breaking it. Then authenticate as that service principal. Then create a new user. So it creates that kind of privilege escalation in that context. Another thing to be aware of are key vaults, right? So Azure key vaults are the place where a lot of Azure customers end up storing passwords and secrets. Like we just got through talking about how Azure functions should be calling key vaults to obtain secrets. And a lot of times organizations end up using key vaults for that specific purpose. So if you have the ability to gather data from a key vault, you might find that you can get a lot of credentials. One of the cool things about key vaults is Contributors. So if you're a contributor of a key vault and you go to read the keys from that key vault, you get access denied. However, the reason is because you have to be an owner to actually read by default. However, contributors can actually set permissions on the key vault so that they can read it. So there are ways to actually use contributor level access to read data from key vault. Microsoft 365 compliance search. So this is another thing that is really interesting, where if you're able to compromise a Microsoft 365 e-discovery manager role, so this could be like an administrator, compliance officer, or e-discovery manager, you can actually do searches via this compliance portal across all of these different Microsoft 365 services. So if you're looking for data, if you're looking for sensitive data, things like, passwords in emails, passwords in, Teams messages, or you just want to do some serious recon across all these different services, you can actually run a report from the compliance portal. So just something else to consider. All right, let's talk about leveraging some scanning tools to wrap up here. Now, whenever I get assigned to do a cloud penetration test, generally we're operating from that API level, like I mentioned, where we're given a set of credentials that can authenticate to the cloud service and have reader level permissions across all of the other resources. And the reason we want to do that is because we want to be able to identify any vulnerabilities, right, across all those different services. And if we can't read them or if we can't see them, then we can't effectively tell the customer what's wrong, right? So one of the things that we end up doing is obviously like on red teams and stuff, we don't just jump right into running scanning tools, but on these almost like configuration audits of sorts, we tend to leverage these scanning tools so that we can identify a lot of these common issues much more quickly. So things like IAM permissions, the public accessibility of resources is the big one. Because like a lot of times, we can enumerate this stuff externally by doing like brute forcing. However, that's not the most effective way to do it. If you can just read from the account and see that this storage bucket is public, that can be something you can identify very quickly from a scanning tool. VM and instance storage encryption, network ingress, egress security rules, serverless data, VM metadata, that kind of stuff. So one of the main tools that I like to use is Scout Suite from NCC Group. So Scout Suite, you give it the credentials to authenticate to the account, and it will authenticate, and then go to town enumerating all of the different resources from that account, and give you this report that it generates. You can click through it and kind of identify specific vulnerabilities much quicker. Like I've been on engagements where we've got like 90 different accounts with like hundreds of thousands of resources, and a lot of those types of assessments, it's like, sure, I could like just start looking through each VM one by one, but that would take forever. But if you have something to help automate those scans, this will help push your testing much quicker. In addition to that, skip too far. In addition to that, there's a lot of other really good Azure-specific tools to look at. So Road Tools is one by Dirk-Jan Malema that is phenomenal for enumerating all of the Azure AD information. So that will pull back all of the users, groups, service principals, MFA configuration, devices, that kind of stuff. There's a couple PowerShell tools out there to help facilitate post-compromise of Azure environments. And a lot of this is like, getting data from key vaults or, a few different other things. But so PowerShell and Microburst are those two. Scout Suite we just talked about. Storm Spotter and Azure Hound are both very similar to, they both are tools that allow us to help identify paths of escalation, right? And can be very, very, very helpful in engagements. All right, so key takeaways. Recon, especially if you're just going black box against an Azure environment, is going to be key to understanding that cloud asset usage. Cloud attack surface is going to enable multiple ways for us to gain access. like I mentioned, we talked about password spraying, using keys, right, to authenticate or certs. Configuration of cloud resources is it's a wild west and it's changing daily. This means that we've got a lot of customers that are jumping in to cloud environments and not really understanding the implications, right? Configuration key methods for gaining a foothold include key disclosure and repositories. So I talked about that briefly, but what I mean there is by discovering where a piece of code got posted publicly, and accidentally somebody submitted secrets within that code. We talked about password attacks. Phishing is still king. And then lastly, remote code execution. If you can execute like on a web app, you might be able to hit that metadata service, and it opens up a whole other set of opportunities there. And then after getting credentials, situational awareness is going to help drive those decisions post-compromise. But that is it. That is it for today, guys. And I hope you guys enjoyed it. Whenever we have like in-person meetups and stuff, I got to come out there to Tampa because I definitely miss hanging out with people. But yeah, like I said, I mean, I live over here in Lakeland, so I'm not too far from you guys. You guys are in Tampa. But thanks for coming. Thanks for having me, Braces.
Hey, thank you so much for hosting this, and yeah, we'll definitely have you down. Next time there's an outage.